Oh, this is my day. I'm ready to take it on, come what may.
Hey YouTube! So this is a continuation of my update on why I left New York and how I ended up spending a sabbatical in Singapore. So I stopped at the point where I was talking about gentrification in New York as a result of the Great Recession. So there are all these kids moving into New York City from the rural cities and towns because of course they couldn't find jobs there. And here was I looking to move into Manhattan to probably join the team at Sloan Kettering. And there's one day I was riding on the train and there was this kid, a white kid, who seemed to be like 18 or 19 years old, who was panhandling. He's like a big kid, maybe about 250 pounds. And so I asked him what's happening, why is he doing this on the train? And he was explaining that he had to drop out of college because his mom got sick and he needed to stay home to take care of her, and therefore he couldn't work and he couldn't go to school, and therefore he ended up on this train. This is 2011. And I'm thinking, wow, this stuff is really, really tough. And I just couldn't see myself going to work every day in Manhattan under these conditions. This was just before the beginning of the movement. Remember the Occupy Wall Street movement? In fact, by the time I got to Singapore, Occupy Wall Street was in full session, and I was able to observe it from my hotel room in Singapore. So here's what happened. By September, I decided that I was going to go to Singapore instead of to Manhattan, and so I accepted the position and left from JFK to Singapore. So the trip from JFK to Singapore was on Singapore Airlines, and there was a stopover in Germany. So the trip from JFK to Frankfurt was 8 hours non-stop, and then there was another 12-hour flight from Frankfurt after a 2-hour layover, 12 hours to Changi Airport in Singapore from Frankfurt. I arrived at Changi about noon, and I arrived at Changi about 9 a.m. I believe, and my check-in time was I think about noon. However, I got out early. I took a taxi and headed down to my hotel. It was a Trader's Hotel, and now I think it's called Hotel Jen on Cuscaden Drive, about 2 blocks over from Orchard Road. I spent the next 3 weeks staying in that hotel. I had to change rooms I think once because there was a problem with AC in one of the rooms, but in fact it was a very good hotel. A bit expensive, so I didn't actually eat in the hotel. I did most of my eating outside by shopping at the nearby grocery stores and so on, but all in all it was a very good stay, and it was a pretty good quality hotel. The first thing I had to settle was how I would deal with finance, with money. So I didn't bring a whole lot of cash with me, but I did have access to my bank card, and so I found the nearest ATM. It turns out it was Citibank, with which I had an account in New York, and so my Citibank card worked exactly as it did in New York. What's great about Citibank is that I could link my account. I eventually opened a Citibank account in Singapore, and I could link my American account with my Singapore account, and therefore it was just if I was just moving money within the same city. There were no transaction fees, so that was really, really good. The next problem I had to solve was transportation. So I was taking taxis for the first 3 weeks because I didn't really know my way around the city, and it was a while before I actually learned the train system. But Singapore has a really, really good ground transportation and train transportation system. My nearest stop when I was at that Hotel Jen in the first 3 weeks was on Orchard Road. In fact, it was the Orchard stop, and from that stop you can go get to anywhere on the MRT line. So what is great about the trains in Singapore is that they were even more efficient and more modern and up-to-date than the train system in North America. They used a Metro card that was similar to the Metro card in the US, in New York, but in fact better in the way that you could travel from one stop to the next and simply pay for the distance you covered. So you could end up paying like, I don't know, 30 cents for a ride or 16 cents depending on how far you went. And if you went the entire length of the line, you might end up paying about $2. The exchange rate back then was 80 cents US to one Singapore dollar, so it wasn't really expensive at all to get around by train. The next problem I had to solve was food. So Singapore is known for its variety. It has a wide variety of food, from Chinese to Indian to Malay and everything in between. You know, all of Thailand is represented, Philippines, Indonesia, all of Asia is represented in Singapore cuisine. And the problem is that I spent most of my time in New York eating Western food, so I couldn't easily make the transition to food in Singapore. In addition to this, food was a lot more expensive in Singapore than it is in New York. It took me a while to realize that meat was like 5 times more expensive, and vegetables, although not expensive, were still pretty pricey. So for the first few weeks or so, I actually used mostly cereals. So I had cornflakes and breakfast cereals. Part of the reason is, of course, because I couldn't stomach the variety of foods there. Eventually I did find a bakery, I think something similar to Panera, and so I spent a lot of my time there eating their breads. Problem is, of course, breads are treated as a delicacy, and so they're not very common. They're not part of the main cuisine. The cuisine is mostly noodles and rice. Anyway, over time I got adjusted and eventually found my way to a grocery store where I could buy the things that I needed and cook them. And eventually I settled on seafood and a lot of canned goods. The next problem I had to solve was, of course, housing, getting a place to rent. Housing and rents are extremely expensive in Singapore. You have to come up with about $3,000 to $4,000 in initial payments. It's like your security deposit is 2 months rent, and the rent could be 2,000 Singapore dollars a month. In fact, my rent eventually settled at 3,400 Singapore dollars a month. Actually, it was 3,700 Singapore dollars a month, so I had to come up with close to $8,000 for my security deposit, 2 months rent. Right, so that is one of the challenges. The other challenge is, of course, you need an agent to find a place in Singapore. So I had to find an agent. I had to get an agent. Eventually, one was provided for me, but there is an agent's fee, and there's this thing called stamp duty, which brings me to the problem with taxes. So overall, I actually enjoyed my stay in Singapore. Housing, I ended up in a nice complex, nice housing complex. It was built more like a resort with outdoor pool and, you know, places and parking and places to play golf and so on, tennis and so on. So that was really, really good. But the tax issue has 2 sides to it. One is that your income tax is very, very low. You pay probably 1 or 2% on income tax, but taxes on things like vehicles, to buy a car, for example, is extremely expensive, something like 400 or 500 or 600% markup on the price of a car. And so I avoided the taxes by not buying a car. Travel around Asia from Singapore was also really, really good because in my case I am Guyanese, and so my citizenship allowed me to travel in Asia without a visa. So I didn't need a visa to enter Singapore, I didn't need a visa to enter Malaysia or any of the surrounding countries. So traveling around Asia from Singapore was very easy for me. I took the bus from Singapore to Malaysia. It was like a 5-hour trip, and ended up in a city that was just as nice as, I believe, as nice as Singapore. Ended up staying at the Traders Hotel in Malaysia, just across the street from the tower, the Petronas Tower, and ended up staying for free because I spent so much time at the hotel in Singapore, Traders Hotel in Singapore. I had like a bunch of nights free at other sister hotels to the Traders Hotel around Asia. Also, traveling internationally from Singapore was easy. I remember flying back to Canada, to Toronto, via South Korea, Incheon Airport, and flying also via Japan through Tokyo. And so flights were cheap or inexpensive and regular, frequent. So Singapore turns out to be a really good hub for operating anywhere in Asia or even internationally, globally. So in summary, by the end of my trip to Singapore, I had gotten accustomed to the food. I'd settled on Japanese boxed lunches. Those turned out to be reasonably inexpensive, like $7 for a box lunch, and didn't give me any kind of digestive after effects. I didn't like the Chinese soups. Like I said, the variety of food was really, really great, but I found that the meats were very, very poor quality in some of the soups in the Chinese dishes. So I couldn't, after a time, stand those, because when you compare to meats in America, I mean, you usually get premium meat in your food, even if you get it from a fast food restaurant. But in Singapore, the quality of the meat can vary, and it's usually, if you simply buy it from one of the hawker centers, it's usually not that great. There are pretty good hawker centers and cafeterias around that I eventually got used to. There was one at Clementi Station, and there are a couple of good places to eat near Holland Village, and of course if you go down Orchard Road, there are lots and lots of places to eat. I ended up spending the rest of my sabbatical in Canada, and so I'll tell you how I left Singapore and how I ended up spending my time in Canada, eventually starting companies, and eventually moving back to Guyana to set them up. So, hope you enjoyed this part of the update. Please like and subscribe for more updates and more videos, eventually daily vlogs, and share this video with your friends on other social media platforms. Later!